Well, hi everybody. Thanks for joining us this morning or this afternoon, depending what time zone you're in. I'm Tobias Schultz, the Manager of Corporate Sustainability Services, and I'm joined here by Adam Gordon, the Account Manager, Supply Chain with CDP. Adam, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Adam, we can hear you just fine.
Perfect.
Great. So for today, we have a pretty straightforward agenda. Adam and I will spend just a few minutes introducing our then Adam will be who uses it and why you should use it. And then I will speak on the topic of doing climate footprints right. And I'll give a little bit of scientific background, some of the key elements in doing a credible scientific climate footprint, and then talk some about how SCS can help. After that, we'll have a bit of time for questions. And during the presentation, if you have any technical issues, please send a chat message to SCS staff or organizer.
Meeting.
Sorry, SCS meeting. Send a chat message to SCS meeting. You should be able to see it in a little chat window on the Don't send me or Adam chats because we'll be talking and won't be able to see it. And at the end, this is how we'll take the Q&A as well using this chat function. All right, so I'll kick this off to Adam for a moment to introduce himself and CDP. So why don't you go ahead, Adam?
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction. If we can go to the next slide. Can we go to the next slide?
Right. Okay. Sorry, Adam.
Nonetheless. So I want to thank you all for joining us on this webinar. We really are excited to be partnering with SCS and excited to be on this webinar today. So I work with CDP. I'm an account manager in our supply chain program, which I'll talk about, but I'll talk about CDP more generally, and I am out of our New York office. We are a global organization headquartered in London. However, we have a very prominent office for North America in New York. My contact information is on the screen, should you feel the need to contact me after this. Next slide. So really quickly, as background on CDP, for those of you that are familiar with our organization, that's great. Just to start at the beginning, though, our mission as a nonprofit organization is to transform the global economic system to prevent dangerous climate change and value our natural resources by putting relevant information. Now, what that means in real terms, next slide, means that we work with investors and companies to facilitate the disclosure of corporate environmental data and create a platform for that to be used in investment and operational procurement decision-making. Like I said, we're an international nonprofit, and we do provide the only global system for companies and even cities to measure, disclose, and manage and share vital environmental information. This platform takes a few different forms, but relevant to this conversation, it is relevant for publicly traded companies to disclose their environmental impacts to their investors. We have a large number of investor signatories that request data from the companies they invest in. It's also relevant if you are disclosing to your requesting your requesting customers. Give me one moment. So to your requesting customers, so we have several companies that go to their suppliers with the CDP questionnaire and use CDP data in their procurement process. We do have some other programs, cities do disclose with CDP.
Yeah. It's some difficult to hear. Can you maybe get a little bit closer to the mic?
Yeah, I'm using a headphone, so that's a little surprising. Can you hear me now?
Slightly better.
Okay, I'll just hold the mic right next to my voice. So we do go Can you hear me now? Hello?
Hi, Adam. Sorry about that. We had just a technical glitch, but we should be able to hear you now.
I'm here. I can call in if it's better. But can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you all right. There's a few sirens in the background, I think.
That's
New York.
Yeah, that's New York for you. I think they'll pass through before the next round comes. So, as I was saying, there are different authorities through which CDP requests the data, and then additionally there are different topics that CDP requests data about. We started with climate change information, but have since expanded to water and more recently forest data. Next slide. Next slide.
Hi, Adam. This is Tobias again. Sorry about that. We really couldn't hear you there. So what we will do is we will just take a moment, and I'll talk about SCS, and then Adam will come back to you. Hopefully we have a chance to get to some less of the best. So let's see. I'm just pulling up my slides. Well, hi everybody. This is Tobias Schultz again with the Corporate Sustainability Services team at SCS Global Services. So I'll spend just a minute talking about SCS and our background, and then about my background in particular. Now, SCS is a neutral third-party certification body. We've offered different types of environmental certifications for the past 30 years. Actually, I think 31 years now. We celebrated our 30th birthday last year. Today, we offer 60 environmental certifications in many different major industries, so everything from forest management related issues to carbon offset verification to even things like recycled content verification, and of course climate footprints, which is what I'm talking about here today. I have been at SCS for a bit more than 5 years doing climate footprints and life cycle assessments. Now I have a technical and scientific background. I have a master's. So I really bring a scientific perspective to issues around sustainability, and this is what SCS does in all of our environmental certification programs. We bring really the best science to bear in this field. And today I'll apply that scientific lens to this question of climate footprints. And specifically, I'll here be talking about doing climate footprints right using the best science. Now, everything I'm going to say in the following slides, I just want to make a couple comments before I dive in. This is all based on published science. Nothing I'm going to say is new or even would be really considered controversial in the scientific realm. Everything is well regarded and well published science. Now, it might seem provocative. It might be some things you didn't know before, but really, I'm just reiterating science which has been published and well understood. And a lot of the slides, you'll even see my citations and footnotes. And in the Q&A, I'm always happy to talk more in depth about it. Now, some of these comments we're in the business of applying science correctly to these types of issues to get to the best answers. And we really believe that having the best science brought to bear in these issues is really the most important to do and of the best value to our clients. Because in our view, if clients don't have the best science, so they can be misled about the information that they receive and can't make the best decisions, business decisions that are possible. So it's really crucial to bring this science in. So with that being said, here we go into my slides. Now, a little bit of background on where we are in climate change. This chart here is a chart on the horizontal axis from 1900 historical data out to projected to 2100 of the global mean temperature compared to pre-industrial. Now, this is predicted by a consensus of major climate models by most of the climate scientists in the world would agree on this trajectory. So you can see that today we're at about 0.8 degrees Celsius over the pre-industrial condition. And in fact, the international and scientific community have predicted that there's several climate tipping points coming soon over the next few decades. And specifically, they predicted 3 of these climate tipping points. The first will reach in 2035 when the global mean temperature passes 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature. That's the 1.5 degrees Celsius tipping point. The second is the 2 degrees Celsius tipping point, which will pass in about 2050. And the third is the 4 degrees Celsius tipping point, which will pass in about 2100. Now, each of these have increasingly irreversible climate impacts. You can see I pointed out this 2 degrees Celsius as the UN goal, because in fact that's the entire subject of the United Nations treaty negotiations. The entire intended target is to stay below this 2 degrees Celsius tipping point, to keep temperatures below that. And if you've been following the news, you may have heard about the convention, a conference of parties is what it's called. It's about to happen in Paris next month. So there's something like 20,000 delegates from 190 different countries traveling to Paris to figure out solutions to keep the global mean temperature underneath this 2 degrees Celsius tipping point. Now, 2 degrees and 4 degrees and the rest of these were not chosen by accident. And just to show some of the evidence, I'll show you an excerpt from a report by the World Bank, which was published a couple of years ago. So this is just straight out of this report from 2013. I'll quote it verbatim. The task of promoting human development, ending poverty, increasing global prosperity, and reducing global inequality will be very challenging in a 2 degrees Celsius world. But in a 4 degrees Celsius world, there is serious doubt whether this can be achieved at all. So you can see that there's no accident that this 2 degrees Celsius tipping point really is a key for us to stay under if we want to keep these climate impacts in hand. And World Bank here, this is actually quite a conservative group, so it's quite remarkable that they'd make statements like this. And I would definitely point out that I know it's mostly business-type people who are on the phone today, but all these impacts, this is not good for business either. I mean, the level of economic disruption that could be occurring over the next few decades is not something that's going to be trivial going forward. Now, I'll talk some about the science behind global warming, and I'll promise I'll at least try to do this in under 1 minute. And the key to understand global warming is I'll use if you instead analogy between that and force scientists have measured that watts per meter squared. It basically speaks to the term. On the now, also the prediction is that about 1.3 watts per meter squared, each of that will lead to about 1 degree Celsius of warming. Now, it won't happen immediately. It happens over time, just like when you put heat on under a tea kettle. It takes time for the tea kettle already sort of suggested very for decades. And as projected, this radiative. The problem for us is not just a problem for our day. We're already in about that in order to postpone these tipping points. This COP21 meeting about and if you look at the situation today, and these people are going to meet next month, so I think a reason we may all ask just this Paris conference. So this is a graphic just straight out of this on Monday. The executive secretary of the UN change. She is essentially the lead administrator of these negotiations. And plan set a clearly successful climate actions, not only low economic and governments. Great, right? But I know as in the business realm, we might want a little bit more quantitative information than that. In fact, they did provide this quantitative information in this report. At what will happen on the emissions going forward over time. So this is that figure straight out of this report. I don't need to talk about it in detail, but basically it says from 2000 out to 2030, the sort of projected business as usual emissions are the orange line. What the treaty negotiations could achieve, and the best case scenario is what by these little yellow bars. And so I don't need to talk about all this. I took this straight out of the report. But the summary here is that they think this entire treaty negotiation, in a best case scenario, by 2030 will achieve perhaps a 5% reduction in CO2 emissions. Now, how much does this turn out to in terms of rate? A bit of numbers together to actually look at that. And what the chart shows is this radiative forcing over the same time period. And the business as usual, of course, is the purple line. And what this best case scenario is with this 5% emission reduction. As you can see, the purple line, as we said, goes past 2 watts per meter squared by 2020, 2.6 is the red line, up to over 3 watts per meter squared by about 2030. And you can see by this orderly barely reduces radiative forcing. There's only about a 2% reduction there about in forcing achieved by this optimistic negotiation. So not the most optimistic outcome. And you might also ask, well, how are the tipping points being affected? How is this $350 billion actually affecting climate change going forward? And so these three figures depict the global temperature, mean temperature today, and projected out to 2035 and 2050. You'll recall under business as usual, we'll pass this 1.5 degrees Celsius tipping point by 2035 and 2 degrees by 2050. Now, what has this expenditures accomplished today? Because of this just minor achievement in reducing radiative forcing, there'll be no change on the time that either of these tipping points are passed. Now, how can this be? If you look at the actual way these mechanism is steered and the way the $350 billion is spent, it's entirely allocated based on, you can think of it as the carbon footprints that are out there. If you've ever heard of people talk about total greenhouse gas emissions, or carbon dioxide equivalents. There's a specific metric under a carbon footprint that's used to prioritize and steer all of the funding in specific directions. And the problem is that there's serious scientific issues with these current carbon footprints, which mean that they prioritize efforts with no effect on radiative forcing. And I'll talk about some they present these serious problems. Now, I also said that this is not just me saying this. This is in another part of this report. Christiana Figueres said, current efforts are by no means enough to keep below 2 degrees Celsius. So carbon footprints is not allowing for cost-effective and effective implementation of solutions. You might argue, well, $350 billion clearly isn't enough. Perhaps these guys in Paris, these guys and ladies, I should say, think that we should spend more money, and they'll agree to spend more money. And in fact, there's many estimates out there about what people think it would take. And the International Energy Agency predicts that about $1 trillion per year will probably do it to reduce CO2 emissions dramatically. Now, what would these current carbon footprints do with $100 trillion per year? Now, I'm certainly a business person, and if I see $350 billion per year not being spent that well, I might sort of wonder, well, what are we going to get for additional investment under this current system? And in fact, the United Nations Environment Program did an assessment of this, and they looked at the effect of $1 trillion per year invested on the effects on the climate tipping points. They found that the current carbon footprints, because they're based on this outdated science, they would actually cause greater warming by 2035. So they'd actually potentially increase global warming by another 0.2 degrees Celsius by 2035, past what we're already expecting. So essentially, the outdated science that's being used to guide this policy is steering us in completely the wrong direction and could actually accelerate the time some of these climate tipping points are passed. Now, why is this the case specifically? This is because these planned mitigation efforts have an unintended consequence of reducing coolants. Now, you probably have never heard of coolants. They're formed from sulfur. Basically, they're a white-colored substance when they're in the atmosphere that reflects sunlight back out into space. When you get rid of them, it adds radiative forcing very quickly because you lose that cooling effect. And so the projections are that we could add 0.5 watts per meter squared under the current mitigation system. This is a big issue because coolants are also something called strong acids, so nobody actually wants them around, and people want to regulate them out. They're a specific subject of the Clean Air Act, for example. But an unintended consequence of that policy and unintended carbon footprints is that mitigation efforts lose coolants, which can very quickly add radiative forcing. The UN also looked forward to 2050 on what would be achieved by then, and they found that there'd be no effect on global warming by 2 degrees by 2050, that the 2 degrees Celsius tipping point will be passed by about the same time. Why is this? This is because 90% of the planned mitigation focuses only on CO2. So this might seem just completely contrary to everything you've heard. And I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't focus on CO2 and it's not important. And in fact, it does reduce forcing. However, the forcing reductions don't occur until later this century. And in fact, there's no benefit until, I'll say again, this isn't just me saying this. This is major scientists saying this. And this is an excerpt straight from this report by the United Nations Environment Program and World Meteorological Organization. Direct quote, reducing CO2 emissions does little to mitigate warming over the next 20 to 30 years. With the CO2 mitigation alone, warming exceeds 2 degrees Celsius before 2050. Now, I'm not trying to argue that we shouldn't tackle the climate change issue because it is such a serious impact affecting the world and potentially our businesses. But what I will argue here is that we need to use better science in the mitigation that we do. And then on a company level, for you here thinking about doing a carbon footprint, it's very important that you use the correct science when you're doing it, so you're actually getting the most valuable information for what you're sort of putting in as you possibly can. And I want to show you that the science is not just pessimistic. I mean, this has been pretty pessimistic, but if you look at the science and look what's been published, in fact, there's plenty of ways that can immediately reduce radiative forcing. The problem with carbon footprints, just don't consider them. Postpone these climate tipping points. And in fact, this same report from the United Nations in 2011 identified some specific issues that can do this. And they found that by reducing something called black carbon emissions, which would be cost effective to do for just $20 billion per year by 2030, we could reduce forcing immediately by as much as 0.6 watts per meter squared just within a 10-year period. And if we focus on methane abatement, we could reduce methane emissions globally by 40% for just $4 billion per year. And this would actually reduce forcing minus 0.5 watts by 2030. Now, these are very significant because they'd actually delay the time this 1.5 degrees Celsius tipping point is reached by as much as 20 years. Now, clearly these are very cost-effective solutions. If you think about the cost of investing in the CO2 project, which was at $1 trillion per year, and the $350 billion per year that's already being spent for no effect, based on these estimates, we could actually slow global warming immediately enough to postpone tipping points for 10 billion per year. So very significant potential there. The problem is the correct science isn't being used to identify these opportunities. And that's because these current carbon footprints ignore and underestimate by 80% the benefits of methane abatements. Now, just summarizing some of the problems with these current carbon footprints, these are the ones being used in setting this policy through Paris, but they're also very commonly used in company carbon footprints. Some of their major problems: for one, they ignore 60% of climate pollution, including black carbon and these coolants, so they can't identify the benefits of reducing black carbon or the unintended consequences of reducing coolants. As I said, they underestimate the benefits of methane reduction significantly. This is all because these are not based in the latest science of radiative forcing, and they don't give a way to manage the radiative forcing, which is clearly what we need to do. And in fact, these current carbon footprints are for the most part based in 20-year-old science that haven't been updated with the huge wealth of information and knowledge that's been gleaned since then. These carbon footprints also don't. You see just the data immediately in front of us and what IPCC has projected. We have 10 years perhaps to really get a strong handle on this. And finally, these current carbon footprints, they're not supported by climate scientists. Climate scientists are very critical of the way current carbon footprints are being applied because of the use of this outdated science. Sorry, I skipped ahead a slide, but I wanted to bring this home now and make it more specific because this is all very high-level stuff. I really want to bring home how in order to help reduce forcing and ensure using the best science and getting the best information in your own company's climate footprint, it's very important that it should be based on the science of radiative forcing. Now, what are the benefits of basing your climate footprint in radiative forcing? So you can get everything you need in terms of reporting through the WRI-GHG protocol and through reporting to CDP. You can fully assess the greenhouse gas emissions according to all the existing frameworks. And these climate footprints easily integrate into existing greenhouse gas programs. They don't actually need hardly any additional data. And if they do need additional data, it's very minor to collect that can be integrated into your current data collection platform. But these footprints are based in the latest science of radiative forcing. They include all climate pollution and recognize the real urgent time frame for action we need. And this allows you to make the most cost-effective decisions you can and gives you the best information you possibly can. And finally, there's wide support from climate scientists and environmental groups for use of these updated climate footprints because they just see that they're necessary if we want to have any chance of postponing these climate tipping points. And in fact, there's protocols for the updated climate footprints being standardized in the US under the ANSI process and internationally. In fact, the official negotiating position of the US delegation, so this is another treaty negotiation, the ISO standards, the official position of the United States is that international standards should be revised to include climate footprints based on the latest science. And there's wide support that develops the greenhouse gas emissions standards at ISO. So quite far along in the standards process with wide multi-stakeholder support. Wide support for new protocols. So as I said, climate scientists support them. In fact, there's been in-depth technical review by eminent climate scientists like Michael McCracken from the Climate Institute, Robert Howarth from Cornell University. I don't have his colleague, Anthony Ingrafia, but he's also from Cornell who has reviewed this. Dr. Ramanathan from Scripps Institute has reviewed the protocols, as has Mark Jacobson from Stanford University, and Drew Schindel from Duke University, who used to be at NASA, has provided a cursory review as well. So scientists support this. These are eminent climate scientists, some of the best regarded climate scientists in the entire world. But on the standards committee developing this, there's other stakeholder groups that support it. So this includes government, carbon registries, industry representatives, as well as environmental groups. And in fact, there's a whole coalition of environmental groups in 5 continents which support the use of these climate footprints. So you may not recognize everybody on this list, but some of these environmental groups are considered at the leading edge of advocating for climate change reform. So groups like the Citizens Climate Lobby, National Wildlife Federation, and the Sierra Club are all supporting of these climate footprints. So it's important to be aware of what they're asking for in terms of climate disclosure. Now, I started at the general. I've taken it more specific. Now I'll take it to an even more specific level, talking about climate footprints at your company and how you can use them there. Now, there's a few steps to this process. First, you have to assess the climate footprint, and the very first step in that is setting the scope of your climate footprint. So this is actually a chart straight from the WRI GHG protocol, which you may have heard of before. That's the World Resources Institute, is a group which has developed a standard which sets up some guidelines for establishing climate footprints, and this is straight out of their standard. And the steps to setting the scope are you determine what is included in the footprint. It shows scope 1, and that's the facilities and vehicles you own. So really what that boils down to is the fuel use at the facilities that your company owns, and in vehicles that your company owns, just the emissions from that fuel use. Scope 2, this is energy indirect. Now this involves the emissions associated with the energy that's purchased at your facilities, and 99% of the time this is basically the purchased electricity used at your facilities that you own, just the emissions associated with that purchased electricity. Now scope 3, this is the other indirect emissions. This is the most categories, if you see here. And so this is where you really start getting into the supply chain of different products, looking at purchased goods and services, and the transportation and distribution of those services, but also looking at things like business travel and employee commuting, and even downstream activities such as the use of products which you sell, which your company sells, impacts from franchises and investments and things like that. Now once you've determined that scope of the climate footprint, collect the data in order to establish it. Now a lot of the time this can seem quite overwhelming, but in fact SGS has a targeted approach to data collection in order to minimize that effort. We're really focused on what are going to be the climate hotspots in your company, and really just collect data on that and do different statistical techniques to make extrapolations to come up with a really robust footprint that minimizes the data collection effort. Because we understand this can be a giant headache to collect data from your facility managers at other locations, but even harder if you're actually getting into the scope 3 and looking at your supply chain. It can be very difficult, if even possible, to collect good data from suppliers, and so it's very important to minimize the effort that goes into that, so as you don't burden yourself with tons of work and cause stress amongst your suppliers for data points that might not even be relevant to the final footprints. Once you've set the scope and collected the data, you then move on to establish your climate footprint. And I'm just going to show an example here of a climate footprint SGS published this last month for New Leaf papers. Now you may have heard of New Leaf. They produce recycled and different types of papers, and we produced a climate footprint going to scope 3 for annual production of their new recycled paper product. The climate footprint was about 4,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And you can see this breaks it down into scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 for the production impacts. And so this is the full climate footprint that included black carbon, the latest science around methane and coolants. And you can see once you roll it all up, it still gives you the same results and the same sort of type of information as you're used to seeing It just provides it based on the latest science and using the best information out there, best data out there. Now, once you've set the scope and actually established your climate footprint, it's then now time to set goals and take action. And this involves things like deciding when you want to act and by how much you want to reduce your company's emissions. So setting up specific targets and timeframes for action. The benefit of using this climate footprint approach that SCS can help you with is that you can identify the best types of mitigation opportunities, things that focus on black carbon and methane, and get really the biggest bang for your buck and actually have the most aggressive conventional carbon footprint. They'll be able to get basically more for your money. So there's a big benefit in using this latest science too when it comes to goal setting and taking action. Now, once you've gone through this process, done your climate footprint, set up a sort of a climate action plan for your company, now it's time to report your achievements and try to get some marketing value and business value and talk about the good work that you've done. Now, there's many different ways to report your achievements depending on what you're trying to achieve. You could publish climate footprints on your company website. You could participate in conferences and other sorts of marketing materials. You could also report to the CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. So this is a great way to sort of put the icing on the cake in your climate footprint and really have the most transparency and most awareness of the good work you've done. Now, if you are interested in disclosing the CDP, the reporting period starts on February 1st. So it's time to start preparing your response now. It's time to start collecting the data so you actually report to CDP in time. Now, I just wanted to show an example of how this newly paper, now they did it in a variety of ways to sort of drum up interest in their brand and this product. They had a joint press release. They got recognition from several environmental groups. Canopy is a well-regarded environmental group. They advocated how great this climate footprint was, and it demonstrates the benefits of this product. This was of high value to New Leaf Papers. We work closely with environmental groups who are quite interested in recognizing companies that kind of go this extra mile in their climate disclosure. New Leaf Papers, they did blog posts advertising about the great work that they did in this climate impact and this climate footprint. Jeff Mendelson, who's the CEO of New Leaf Papers, actually organized a panel at the Sustainable Brands Metrics Conference, which just happened last month. I had the pleasure of being on the panel with Jeff where we talked about the study and the benefits of it, and that gave Jeff really good exposure for his brand and for the great work that they're doing. And needless to say, he's ended up with all kinds of activity in sort of the Twitter sphere, so there are all kinds of great talk about New Leaf Papers and types of metrics. Now, I really just want to talk about how SCS can help you here and how we really just think we're best suited to help you because you can really trust us in these issues. And for all the reasons I've talked about today, you can understand, hopefully understand, why it's really important not to use this 20-year-old science in your carbon footprint. These are misleading results which can open you up to criticism by environmental scientists. And again, there's no reason to do it. There's protocols out there, the data is ready to go, the science is published. And if you work with SCS, we'll ensure that your climate footprint is based on the best science. We have expert knowledge, our staff has expert knowledge in climate science. We have over 20 years of experience in providing different types of climate services from all different angles, everything from doing climate footprints to verifying climate footprints to looking at emissions in supply chains and for companies. We have extensive experience in many industries. We're very closely connected with some of the world's renowned scientists that I talked about who very closely review our methods and the data sources that we use. This ensures that all the climate footprints that we establish are based in the latest. Use of this latest science allows for credible claims because of our close engagement with environmental groups. So we're careful to keep very appraised of what environmental groups are asking for. So climate footprints based on this latest science can just ensure credibility with the environmental community so there's no criticism that you could possibly get. And finally, our targeted data collection approach just really, again, minimizes the effort entailed but also maximizes the accuracy of the climate footprint that you do establish. Now, if you are interested in climate footprinting and CDP reporting with SCS, if you already have a carbon footprint, we're happy to update your current footprint to the latest science free of charge. So feel free to contact me at that information if you want to look into that. And please look for my article that will be published later this month called Managing Rate to Forcing in Order to Avoid a 2°C World. So this article will be distributed in a magazine that will be distributed to these 20,000 delegates at the COP21 in Paris. So hopefully they listen to what I have to say is what we talked about today. And you can feel free, you can just email me directly based on that address there, or you can also look for a follow-up email from us. You'll see someone either from Janelle Agius or someone else from the SCS team who can help you at this point. So thanks for your time. I think we have Adam back on the phone, don't we?
I'm here. Can you hear me now?
Yes, it's much clearer.
Much clearer. Okay, so I'm calling on the line, and I apologize for that technical difficulty, but Tobias did just give a great presentation. So it kind of leads to a nice little presentation I can do for CDP, and I'll be quick looking at the time. So if we could go back to that, maybe let's start on slide 6. Let's start on slide 5.
Slide 5. Okay.
Okay,
right,
so thanks so much, Tobias. So SCS is an accredited consultancy partner, and we're really they're talking specifically about the role CDP plays in the marketplace and the importance of reporting to the interested stakeholders that your company has. Just to start with a couple quotes. Coming from the UN and the international climate change dialogue that is occurring right now, as Ban Ki-moon has said, the work of CDP is crucial to the success of global business in the 21st century, helping persuade companies throughout the world to measure, manage, disclose, and ultimately reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. No other organization is gathering this type of corporate climate change data and providing it to the marketplace. So that's why it's good. On the right, you could see a little bit more of a reason to investors that we've seen over the years. As of this past year, I know this slide doesn't go up to this current year, well over 800 investor signatories requesting data from the companies they invest in on these issues. The marketplace cares. So there is business value in doing it for yourself, but ultimately your stakeholders care. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that there are many companies out there that are using CDP data in their supply chain management. The 75 different members on the screen are going to their key suppliers with the CDP request and integrating that data into their procurement processes. Now, there are members across industries, across regions. Notably, recently, we also have the GSA on here. GSA is another way of saying the U.S. government as part of Obama's climate change work in April. The U.S. government is now going to its largest suppliers with the CDP request. You also see industry groups like the EICC. WRI is our first nonprofit member. Actually, that's the GHG, the greenhouse gas accounting methodology that's standard globally. And of course, many of what I can imagine are your customers. So next slide. When responding to CDP, it's important to recognize that this isn't creating undue burden in the marketplace. If every customer, if every investor had the same set of questions but had a different questionnaire, it would be quite a burden on you as a company to report it. And so CDP plays the role of simplifying that process. No matter how many investors or how many customers care about your data, want you to report, and we make sure that your relevant stakeholders have access to that data. So it's very important. On the next slide, you can see the types of questions we ask about in our questionnaire. Now, I'll focus on the climate change questions because that's the content of this webinar. But in the core questions of the questionnaire, we discuss the management issues, so your corporate strategies, your targets, the emissions reduction activities that you're taking. We ask you to put a financial figure on the regulatory, physical, and other risks and opportunities that your company faces in light of climate change. And then, of course, the emissions reporting, so this would be your climate footprint. For those companies that are asked to respond by their customers, we do have some additional questions relevant to each particular customer. That is proprietary. Obviously, it doesn't go to the marketplace, on allocating emissions to customers, collaborative opportunities, and so on. Now, it's worth noting that you can respond publicly to CDP, and that data will then go into the marketplace in a variety of ways, but you also can respond non-publicly, essentially privately. And in that case, only the specific customers of yours that are requesting your data will receive it. Next slide. Now, that's what it means to report, and Tobias discussed at length the importance of being involved in this process. Ultimately, there is a scientific call to action, but there's also a business call to action. This is good for business, and our data reflects that. In our last year S&P 500 report, we ran a correlation between, there was a correlation rather, between the return on earnings from the companies, their performance in CDP. So those companies that perform better at CDP have a better and higher ROE. They also experience lower volatility in the marketplace, and just overall are better performing companies. So performing well at CDP is indicative of larger business performance, and the market recognizes that. On the next slide, you can see that CDP data informs the market in a large variety of ways. On several Rate the Raters polls from sustainability, we were rated the most credible and one of the most familiar sustainability rankings in the world, and our data in the market, from the Dow Jones Sustainability Index to MSCI's work, TrueCost, now EcoVadis, SEDEX, were used in Goldman Sachs Biz Data. You could find our data on the next slide. Even on Google and Yahoo Finance, when you search for publicly traded companies, you will also see their CDP scores. And on the next slide, you will also find CDP data for those public responders on Bloomberg terminals. Now, this data is downloaded, click next, quite often. Now, the most recent numbers that I've heard is that it is downloaded CDP data points are downloaded 1 million times every 3 months. So it's gone up on Bloomberg terminals. What this means is when companies report climate information, the investment community cares, they use it. And that's not even to speak about the relevance to supply chain management. This is business decision-making, and CDP plays that role, facilitating that dialogue. And with accredited partners like SCS to support you in that disclosure process, there is a lot to accomplish, and we're really excited to be on this journey. And we hope you'll join us.
Thanks, Adam. We have about 8 minutes left in the hour. I'll give us a couple minutes past that since we had a couple technical issues that did delay it. But the way that we will take questions is if you please just send a chat to the SCS meeting. We'll unmute you or read out your chat and take the questions that way. So again, please insert your questions into the chat function and we'll answer it using that mechanism. You can also raise your hand in the function too. And then well, while we're waiting for people to fill in the box, Adam, I had a question for you. I was wondering what you think. I mean, I've seen how many more investors are coming on. I mean, do you see a lot more sustained growth and continuing growing interest in CDP reporting going forward?
Oh, that's a great question, and thank you for it. Yeah, absolutely. You know, interestingly, when it comes to interest from investors, you know, at this point, it's hard to get much better in terms of that. We've got the largest names in the investment community signed on. The number I've heard most recently is that CDP investor signatories represent a quarter of all investable capital in the world. So a quarter of all dollars that are invested in the marketplace are signatory to CDP. They request that the companies they invest in disclose to CDP. The really exciting area of growth in the market we're seeing more and more companies sign on to utilize CDP data in their procurement process, and you're seeing this in the continual growth of our supply chain program. And this is driving the largest area of disclosure because there are only so many publicly traded companies in the world, but there are quite a few companies that are significant and key to supply chains, and those do change in size. So we're seeing really incredible interest from companies for that program, and with the U.S. government joining the CDP supply chain program this past year, we're seeing interest from other governments and other government agencies as well. So yeah, really exciting, renewed sense of urgency right now on these issues that we're seeing in the marketplace.
Sure, and we had a question come in. Thanks, Adam. That was very informative. We had a question come in, basically just asking, how long does it typically take to measure a carbon footprint? Typically, it'll depend on sort of the complexity of the scope. You know, so if it's just a few facilities included, we'll just anticipate it'll take 2 to 3 months. If it's a quite large sort of scope 3 supply chain that's involved, then even with the focused targeted data collection approach, it can take a bit longer than that. But generally with that, we're still talking about a few months perhaps to collect the data and start synthesizing, integrating to crunch results. So I guess the short answer is usually starting with about 2 to 3 months and perhaps a bit longer for very complex scopes of carbon footprints. We had another question here about how are governments asking for this type of information. That's a very good question, and in fact, in some places of the world, it actually is mandatory to report carbon footprint type data in some context. So if you're in the U.S., for example, and you own a facility, then you have to report to the U.S. EPA, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, through the greenhouse gas reporting program. There's also a lot of regulations that are sort of nascent, but coming down very quickly. So I think it's important to keep in mind that today's voluntary efforts, such as reporting to CDP, might be tomorrow's regulation. I'm thinking of an example we had actually with someone we worked with in Northern California, and it was a large set of agricultural producers, and they hadn't been very concerned about their greenhouse gas emissions. They hadn't yet measured them, but then because of what the state of California requires from the county level, the county had to report its greenhouse gas emissions and its climate footprint. And based on that, they identified these agricultural operations as a specific target to reduce their emissions. So kind of out of nowhere, this outfit was kind of blindsided by this request from the county to begin organizing ways to reduce its.
If I may just jump in as well, in addition to that regulatory push and that risk of regulation, additionally, just in terms of the COP, the upcoming climate change negotiations, CDP data in particular is being used quite aggressively in that process. In the past, traditionally, governments have negotiated about their country's emissions, kind of in a vacuum, we'll say. But more and more, the corporate space is having a role in that conversation because ultimately their operations are going to be impacted. And so through, because it's acronym soup with the UN, our NAZCA portal, the non-state actor zone for climate action, it is a website that the climate negotiators for countries around the world are using to keep track of what the companies in their countries are doing on these issues, and they're taking inspiration from that, but also using that quite aggressively in their
Great, and we had a question here. I'll read it out loud. It's a quite complex question, a technical one, which I always like. So the question is, in terms of the life cycle assessment that SCS conducted with New Leaf papers, how did you gather data for these types of studies? How do you track a product's life cycle and then make calculations regarding its environmental footprint? How can other organizations use these techniques to show the environmental footprints / emissions of their products? So that's a great question. There's actually a couple different questions in it. And so New Leaf Papers was a life cycle assessment, and LCAs are cradle-to-grave assessment tools for all environmental impacts. They're actually there's a lot that's very much similar between an LCA and a very comprehensive Scope 3 climate footprint. And so there's a lot in common between what New Leaf did and the very sophisticated climate footprint. Now, in terms of the data that we collect, I'll talk some about just our data collection approach. We start first with examining the public data sources that are available, and this is in large part what we were able to do for the New Leaf study in order to really winnow down the type of data requests we have to ask of your facilities and suppliers and that sort of thing. We then have a software which crunches the numbers and gives us an analysis result. SCS uses the OpenLCA software package, but there's other software packages you could use at your organization. The OpenLCA tool is unique because it actually allows application of this latest science. The other LCA tools, such as CIMAPRO and GABI, don't integrate this latest climate footprint. And so OpenLCA is kind of using the data in that OpenLCA model. We can assess LCA type results, and sometimes we'll use that for the more sophisticated Scope 3 types of footprints. It's also possible if it's a simple enough climate footprint. I mean, there's spreadsheet tools that can be used as well. So or anything like that, it can be fairly straightforward tools that can enable that. And in terms of other organizations using these techniques, SCS offers trainings on how to use these climate footprints and how to use this OpenLCA software if that's what you're interested in. So there's different ways that we can train you to get you off the ground. Now with that, we're a minute past the hour, so we'll cap it at that. We have a couple more questions, but I think I'll just let you email me or follow up based on our follow-up email to ask those. Thanks everybody very much for your time today, and thanks to Adam for spending the time to speak with us.
Thank you, everyone.
Everybody, have a great day.